The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Yes. Order. Welcome to this afternoon session of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Tahir, forgive me 1 second as I explain why we're wearing these pins. These pins are marigolds, which are worn in India like a poppy is worn in the United Kingdom, and in memory of the many Indian servicemen who fought courageously, and so many sadly died alongside our own armed forces. And so we, as the Foreign Affairs Committee, decided that we would wear marigolds to remember our brothers in arms from the Indian army who fought alongside us so many years ago. Perhaps we can start on Kurdistan, however, this afternoon. Royston.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Tahir, I think I met you at the APPG, the Kurdistan APPG. Did you appear there?
Yes.
I think I remember seeing you there. We'll cut right to the chase then, because I remember the conversations then. I remember it was particularly fraught at the time. So can Kurdish aspirations be met without independence from Iraq, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. And I wish I had one pin to wear it myself, because we always pay our respect and for those who sacrificed, including the ones in Britain and those in Iraq and Kurdistan region. Regarding your question, the Kurdish aspiration and Kurdish nationalism, to understand it, we have to understand the history of Iraq. We have to understand the establishment of Iraq, and we have to go back a little bit and talk about the history and how the Iraq is established. Iraq is established in 1920 under the colonial power then. Kurdistan region was not part of Iraq and was called Mosul Wilayat at that time. And the League of Nations decided to attach Kurdistan region to Iraq, and they conducted a referendum for King Faisal at the time. This included the Kurdish people at that time, because of the fact that they had in mind to create a greater Kurdistan, because at the time the Sevra treaty was exist, and they left the option for the Kurdish people to become part of the greater Kurdistan, if the greater Kurdistan were established. So, and all these facts are available, and the correspondent between the King Faisal and Winston Churchill at that time, and in particular in one of the correspondence when Winston Churchill responds to King Faisal on his demand on the boundary of the new Iraq, and he said to him that we promised you to create an Arab state for you, not an Arab empire. And the British representative at the League of Nations at the time, he made a statement that the condition of attaching Kurdistan or Mosul Wilayah to Iraq was based on the respect of the Kurdish people and satisfying the Kurdish people. Therefore, the unity of Iraq since the olden day up until today was conditional to satisfy the Kurdish people and respect their right within Iraq. So that's mean the Kurdish aspiration is there and will remain there until their full rights are respected, whether within the Iraqi boundary, or if their right were not respected, there will be another way to meet the aspiration of the Kurdish people.
But not, it doesn't have to be full independence, is that what you're saying?
Well, this needs a lot of explanation, because in 2003, after the Kurdish people being attached to Kurdistan region, being attached to Iraq, despite the suffering, despite the persecution, the denial, the genocide, and all that, in 2003 we voluntarily chose to rejoin Iraq and contributed politically, economically, and security. We helped our colleagues from Baghdad that we fought Saddam Hussein and dictatorship together to rebuild Iraq together, based on the new chapter in Iraq, and to have new relationship with Iraq based on the respect of the rights of the Kurdish right and the satisfaction of the Kurdish people. But unfortunately, ever since that we had this constitution of Iraq, the constitution were not respected, violated. Therefore, that led Kurdish people to have left with no choice but to take a different path of referendum towards independence.
I'll move on to your opinion of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Do you feel that they oppose Kurdish independence now, or Kurdish independence at any point?
Well, I was watching the first session of Foreign Secretary at this chamber, when he was asked by Mr. Chairman about the British colonial idea in 2020, and the same argument was repeated by His Excellency the Foreign Secretary in his oral evidence that he gave. So this, for me, it appears for me that this mindset is stuck in the British foreign policy ever since up until today, and they, not only Britain but some other countries, international within the international community, neglecting the fact and the history of the Kurdish people and the matters that they have been throughout the history. So if we don't understand the history, why the Kurd been in this situation, we cannot actually apply an appropriate resolution for the Kurdish issue, not only in Iraq, but the other countries as well. So yes, British foreign policy, they unfortunately opposed the referendum, and actually they, as I heard from Foreign Secretary, they were lobbying to, among the other states to oppose the Kurdish referendum, even though that we have tried our hard, to make the international community understand our intent of referendum, why we want to conduct referendum, what's the reason of conducting the referendum, but unfortunately our message were not conveyed properly to the international community. We only hold the referendum, as I said, because the Constitution were violated, not met. 55 articles of the Constitution were violated before the day of referendum, and we left with no choice just to take this action, which is, we think, is a peaceful path for freedom of expression, which the Iraqi constitution does not bar, and self-determination is not a crime for any nation or people to exercise this right. But unfortunately, they stood against it, and we were disappointed from the international community. We didn't actually expecting the direct support or any support from international community, because we always thought that this is an internal fact, an internal issue between the Kurdistan region and federal government, and we clearly stated that independent Kurdistan must be agreed with the Iraqi federal government, not with anybody else.
Okay, Mike?
Your answer to Mr. Smith, you said that when the Kurdistan region voluntarily rejoined Iraq, is the word you used.
Yes.
But legally, wasn't Kurdistan, even though it was de facto protected because of the no-fly zone introduced by John Major from 91, 92 until 2003, wasn't it legally still part of Iraq at that point? So it wasn't really a question of rejoining.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you all know that the Kurdish people in Kurdistan region rose against the dictatorship in 1991. And thankfully, the British government at the time, they introduced the no-fly zone and the safe haven. When we managed to establish our democratic institution, and we hold the first election in 1992, and then we formed our parliament and government, and we looked after our population. We developed our country, and it was complete secession from the Iraqi government. In fact, they withdraw all the administration. They brought their flags down, and they withdraw from entire Kurdistan region, as the Kurdistan region cannot run their own affair. So we started our journey from there, and when the international community decided to change the regime in Iraq, we've been approached by United States, America, all the coalition that become part of this strategy of overthrowing the dictatorship in Iraq, and we were a real and credible partner to international community, and we contributed. We liberated Kirkuk at that time in 2000.
I appreciate that, and that brings me on to my next question, which is, when you liberated Kirkuk, and then more recently Kurdish Peshmerga forces went into areas which were outside the area which had been Kurdistan region up until 2003 and went further south. That then meant that you were in a period occupying what were disputed territories, because Baghdad did not accept that that was part of Kurdistan. In retrospect, given what's happened since the independence referendum that was held in September, is it a mistake, was it a mistake in retrospect to go into areas which were disputed and control those territories?
Yes. Well, in 2003 we liberated Kirkuk during the time of dictatorship as a partner to the coalition. And we've been asked by coalition to retreat our force out of Kirkuk before the constitution of Iraq were drafted. So we withdraw our forces from Kirkuk. We listened to the coalition partners. After the constitution of Iraq which we played a big role in drafting this constitution in Iraq, we introduced or we suggested an article 140 to peacefully settle the issues of disputed area, because we thought that this is a new Iraq and we will open a new chapter with Iraq, and we will settle all our issues legally and not resort to any violence. That's why the Article 140 was one of the articles that settled all the issues, disputed issues between the Kurdistan region and the government of Iraq. So since 2005 until 2014, we never sent any forces to Kirkuk, any Peshmerga forces to Kirkuk. We had a small presence, Peshmerga presence in Kirkuk and some other disputed area, and that was in agreement with Baghdad and the coalition. They had a joint military presence in this area. In 2014, the rise of ISIS, when the Iraqi military abandoned or left their post and weapon in this area, we had to fill the gap, because otherwise ISIS would fill the vacuum and impose threats on the people of Kirkuk and the disputed area. So we filled the gap. We did not occupy Kirkuk when we had these Peshmerga in this area.
I understand that, and I pay tribute to the bravery of the Peshmerga, and I've been there and seen on the front line of what happened in that period, pushing back Daesh and taking huge numbers of casualties in the process. I understand that. But the question is, should that area have been included within the referendum that was organised in September, or should it not have been included? And do you think that that was a mistake in retrospect?
Well, I don't think it was a mistake. It was agreed by all political parties to conduct a referendum in this area.
Within the Kurdistan, all political parties?
Yes, of course,
okay,
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, to conduct referendum in the disputed area, because the disputed area, we consider them as a Kurdistani area outside the administration of Kurdistan region. And the government of Iraq were obliged to implement the Article 140 and conduct census in this area, normalize, conduct census and referendum, but they failed to do so. And the limitation of implementing this article was 2007. So the people of this area had the right to express their political future in this area. And Kirkuk, historically, it is a Kurdistani area. If we go back, I mean, Britain is one of the countries that we can find most of the evidence on Kirkuk and this, contested area, that Kirkuk is a Kurdistani area. And I can refer back to the history and say that the British representative at the Council, at the League of the Nation, he said it clearly. One of the conditions that attached Mosul Wilayat to Iraq, one of the conditions was prevention of changing the Kurdish identity of Kirkuk. And that was a condition in 1922. So I think the politician, the international community, they have to refer back to the history in order to address an appropriate resolution for this issue. We just want to implement the constitution and give the right to the people. We're not trying to change the identity of Kirkuk and the other areas. We want to give a chance to the people to decide themselves whether they want to be part of Kurdistan region or federal government.
Ian, can I, before you take a Mr. Tahir, do you mind if we try and be a little bit briefer in our answers, if that's all right, and stick to the question? That'd be great.
Thanks, Chair. And welcome to the committee. And I've declared, for the record, the fact that I was in the Kurdistan region and attended several meetings with you in and around the referendum. Now, you said in your written submission that the opposition of the international community to the referendum encouraged the Iraqi government to take what you have described as aggressive action. Do you feel let down by Britain and by the Foreign Office?
Well, I think yes, we've been let down by Britain, by international community, because of the fact that the referendum was a peaceful path, and we have discussed referendum with Iraqi politician in 2016 when former president of Kurdistan region, accompanied by most of the political leaders, went to Baghdad before the start of Mosul liberation. They went to Baghdad in order to seek military coordination with Baghdad, and they discussed this issue of referendum and independence with Prime Minister Abadi and the other leaders. And of course, the foreign minister, Iraqi foreign minister, was present as well. They discussed this issue with them. We either implement the constitution as a whole. We cannot pick and choose from the constitution and say we implement this, we like it, we doesn't like this, we're not implementing it. We either implement it as a whole, or we can go for a referendum. They were receptive of the idea, and they said this can be negotiated, can be, we can talk about this. Let's coordinate first to liberate Mosul. That's what we did. We coordinated, and there was a good coordination between the Peshmerga forces and Iraqi forces in liberating Mosul. We've done the first part of the liberation. We opened the corridor for the Iraqi forces to go through and liberate Mosul, which they did successfully and paid a huge casualty.
Happy? Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon, Mr. Tahir. Afternoon. You submitted that Iraq waged an attack on the Peshmerga and the Kurdistan region. That's what you said in your submission.
Yes.
But the FCO told us that Iraq had used largely peaceful means. So, which is correct?
Well, I think they waged an attack on Kurdistan region because we have casualties. We have 100 Peshmerga killed, injured in the confrontation with the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Unit and the Iraqi security forces. And in fact, the fight and confrontation was not on the footing level, was not balanced fight, because Iraqi military was hugely equipped by the United States tanks, equipment, military equipment, and they're supposed to fight ISIS with these, and apparently they turned their guns towards the Peshmerga force. They could have chosen a different path. They could have asked the government of Iraq, say, okay, we have an agreement, we have to go back to the pre-2014 when we had the joint forces together in this area, and they could have choose this way, but they chose violence and waged an attack on Kurdistan region. They have been stopped in some area, which they were willing to even further go towards the capital of Kurdistan region, Erbil, to take the airports, so, as they were claiming.
I understand what you're saying, but from our point of view, why is there such disparity? Why is our Foreign Office seeing it in a different way to how you're presenting it today? How do we know what really happened? How can we be assured of what really took place for us to make a judgment?
Well, this question should be asked to His Excellency the Foreign Office himself, because I'm not in a position to answer instead of them. But I think some of the reality on ground were not conveyed properly by the diplomats present in Iraq. The other reports, with the permission of Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, I can submit these reports from international organization like Human Rights Watch and some other organizations.
We have many reports in writing already submitted, so I'm not. But you'll be very welcome to talk to the clerks about any reports you might like to add to it.
Yeah, this report about the violation that conducted by Popular Mobilization Unit and Iraqi forces toward the Kurdish people in Kirkuk, Tus-Khormatu, and some other contested area. I mean, humiliation, intimidation. They repealed the civil servant from their work and replaced them with Arab and Turkoman. More than 2,000 houses were looted. 500 houses were seized by the forces in Kirkuk and Tus-Khormatu. 51 houses were exploded. A few more houses were burned. There's abduction and kidnapping on a daily basis.
This is all Iraqi troops doing this?
Yes, this is all Iraqi troop and Popular Mobilization Unit.
And this has all been verified, has it?
It's all documented. It's not my it's not my statement only. It's all documented and stated by the International Human Rights Organization.
On another point, why has the KRG Parliament not met in the last 2 years?
Well, we had the political parties in Kurdistan region. They had some political differences, and unfortunately resulted in.
We have political differences in this Parliament too, but we still meet.
Well, I'm coming to that. The main session of Parliament did not held, but the committees were meeting and following up, following the government, and all the meeting was on action throughout the last 2 years. But it wasn't a right choice to shut the Parliament, but Parliament reconvenced and ratified the decision of referendum, and they are full operating at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Hiya.
Your submission calls for the FCO to now mediate between Erbil and Baghdad. The FCO's submission said it offered to do that before the referendum, but former Kurdish President Barzani rejected this offer and pressed ahead with the referendum. Why did he do that?
Well, we appreciate the effort made by Britain and the Foreign Secretary and the diplomat present in Kurdistan region, British diplomat. But the offer came very late. At the last, it was at the last 2 days for the referendum date. And I'm aware of the meeting that was held between the Kurdistan leaders and the British officials from Britain, that the referendum is a mechanism towards independence. So any alternative to step into this to bring us, to convince us not to conduct a referendum, we will be agree to taking the offer. but the offer came very late, 2 days before the referendum, and the referendum took place.
Nadeem?
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Karwan. To what extent did factionalism within the Kurdistan region and divided loyalties of the Peshmerga contribute to the Kurdish reversals in October?
Sorry, repeat.
Really, my question is, to what extent the Peshmerga not being united contributed to some of the reversals in October post-referendum?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're aware of the Peshmerga, the structure of the Peshmerga force in Kurdistan region. Unfortunately, we've been through some internal differences in 19th that was resulted in 2 administration in Kurdistan region and 2 ministry of Peshmerga. But after the 5th cabinet, the 2 administration were united, and the 2 ministry of Peshmerga were in a process of unification. 8 brigade of these of the Peshmerga force were united, and thankfully, again, British Defense Ministry was helping and providing technical assistance to Kurdistan region to unify the other 6 remaining brigade to unify. Unfortunately, the ISIS emerged, and the forces were in the fight with ISIS and slowed the process of unification of these forces. So some of these forces were stationed nearby Kirkuk, and 1 or 2 brigades were stationed in Kirkuk, and there was 2 brigades consist of united forces, which they paid life and casualties in these 2 brigades. So if we didn't have the fight with ISIS, the Peshmerga force would have been united by now. So hopefully in the next step that we have an agreement now, Ministry of Defense, United States and German have an agreement with Kurdistan Region Ministry of Peshmerga to continue helping the Ministry of Peshmerga to restructure the ministry and unite the rest of the forces.
Well, that was going to be my next question. In your submission, I think it's paragraph 19, you said that the UK had been working to unite the Peshmerga. I wondered whether you could tell us more about how the UK's work has been in that, and how successful have we been in helping unify the Peshmerga?
Well, the unification of Peshmerga was an initiative by the Defense Ministry in Britain. They agreed on plan with Ministry of Peshmerga to unify the ministry and providing them with technical support to restructure the ministry. In fact, the Defense Ministry deployed a permanent commander from Britain to be stationed in the Ministry of Peshmerga and help them on a daily basis to implement the plan. Then they have same offer came from United States, so they widened the plan, involved Britain, United States, and German came into it as well. So it's a tripartite agreement with Kurdistan region to unify the Ministry of Peshmerga, and they are progressing. They still have to implement some of the plan that is agreed upon.
You addressed the issue of the Parliament not convening for 2 years. Do you still think that political divisions remain a problem for the KRG?
Well, personally, I look at the political division as a norm, political norm, because if we look at the political system everywhere in the world, that there's a differences. If there is no differences, we could have one political party. But Kurdistan region is multi-party political system. Of course, there's a differences, but I can see a lot of maturity among the politicians, among the people of Kurdistan at large, and they all committed to solve the differences, to be engaged in dialogue and solve all the differences.
My final question. Last Saturday, President Macron met with Prime Minister Barzani and Deputy Prime Minister Talabani in Paris at the Elysee Palace, and then held a call, I think, with President Trump.
Yes.
On this. Do you think that the UK Prime Minister can do more? Which was, the line was that the need for Baghdad and Kurdistan to work together to resolve their differences within the constitution of Iraq,
of course,
which everybody seems to be agreed on. That the constitution should be the framework by which we work. My question is, one, can we do more? Can our Prime Minister engage more in this? And secondly, what is the appetite for actually getting people in a room and negotiating a resolution to some of these challenges that you're facing?
Well, currently we are in a relationship crisis with federal government of Iraq, and the trust at weakest level between Kurdistan region and Baghdad. We, since 16 October, we've been calling for negotiation and dialogue, and all been rejected by Prime Minister of federal government, His Excellency Abadi. So we need to restore this trust. That's why I have sent a letter to His Excellency the Prime Minister of Britain, Theresa May, on 27 October, I think, or I can't remember exactly, asking her to provide a good ground for negotiation between federal government and Kurdistan regional government, and invite both Prime Minister of Iraq and Prime Minister of Federal Iraq and Prime Minister of Kurdistan region here to Britain, and provide them with a conducive environment to solve their differences and start negotiating within the framework of constitution. I cannot say, unfortunately, she didn't do that, and President Macron did so, but hopefully Britain will follow and invite both Prime Minister Abadi and Prime Minister of Kurdistan region, Nusayr Barzani, to Britain to continue the effort that made by President Macron, and the support from President Trump to the call of negotiation, and hopefully this will be concluded here in London for both of them to be invited here.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Do you think it would have helped, and would it have been possible for our Prime Minister, to have visited the Kurdistan region while she was in Iraq at the weekends? And would it have been possible for her to go? Would it have been helpful if she had? Would it have helped end the blockade, for example? I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, it would be a great opportunity if she was allowed to visit Kurdistan region, because the Iraqi government now rejecting or opposing anyone to visit Kurdistan region, as he did last week for the German foreign minister. He wanted to visit Kurdistan region. He wanted to visit Baghdad and Erbil, but he was told by the foreign ministry that if he wants to come to Baghdad only, he's very welcome, and if he wants to go to Erbil, we don't accept that. That's why he he didn't visit neither Baghdad or Erbil.
The Iraqi Foreign Ministry prevented him from going to Erbil?
Yes, Prime Minister actually.
Right.
Prime Minister of Iraq.
Okay.
So I don't think there will be any chance for even Foreign Secretary, if he wants to visit Kurdistan region, will be allowed by Prime Minister Abbadi for now.
Okay. Any further questions? No? Yes?
Yeah, I have one further question. Just for information, just to clarify, because I'm really not aware, I'd like to know, what relationship does the Kurdistan Democratic Party have with, if any, with the PUK and the Karwan movement?
Well, there's a good relationship with all political parties, despite the differences. And the last week we have seen all political parties, they meet in each other in order to find a way to get out of this crisis in Kurdistan region and Iraq. KDP, PUK, Karwan movement, and the other Islamic political parties, they all heavily engaged in talk for finding a way out of this crisis in Iraq. So there are a good relationship.
There are good relations.
I don't know what's your definition.
How intense are those relations?
I don't know what's your definition of good relationship. They're not fighting each other. They talk to each other.
Do they collaborate with each other?
Well, there is a collaboration between the political parties in Kurdistan region, certainly.
Move on. Very last one from Mike.
Do you think that this crisis with Baghdad will lead to a resolution of the internal divisions which have made things so difficult and dysfunctional in many respects within the KRG?
Well, unfortunately, one of the other factors that the government of Iraq or Prime Minister Abbadi is working on now, trying to create more division among the Kurdish political parties and trying to dissolve the role of Kurdistan region and dissolve or diminish the role of Kurdistan region and treat Kurdistan region as the province like the other province of Iraq, which is again violation of the constitution. By doing so, he telling the people of Sulaimania, for instance, that we're paying your salary and that, and so encouraging them to dismantle the Sulaimania from the KRG. So yes, they are trying to create more division between the political parties.
Okay. Mr. Tahir, thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. It's very great.
Thank you so much.
Have you
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We're going to move on straight away, if we may, to Mr. Semo. Thank you very much for a speedy handover. Nadeem, would you pick up the baton? Thank you.
Thank you. Am I right in saying that the PYD does not want independence from Syria? That's not your position?
That's right, yes. We wanted the federal, democratic, federal Syria.
Has the PYD been involved in any of the negotiations to end the war in Syria?
Not fortunately, no. Not in Geneva.
Not on the ground either? Maybe not in Geneva?
There are some negotiations, but not in Geneva.
Can you just say a little bit more about what's happening on the ground in terms of negotiations?
On the negotiating, they are working closely with the anti-ISIS global coalition, and on the other side they have the balance and they're working with the Russian as well on the ground, and they have been managing themselves since 2012. They established a democratic Rojava and North Syria government, self-governance, protecting themselves and organizing daily life for the people. And they was very successful and defeated lately the brutal ISIS from Syria. And yesterday was the announcement of Eastern Euphrates or Deir ez-Zor have been liberated by the democratic Syrian forces. And they have on the ground their own relation and their cooperative. They are well cooperated with the coalition and with the Russian as well in another side. And they keep the balance to try to protect that area and pushing for a democratic political settlement in Syria, featuring and suggesting the project of federal Syria, united federal Syria, based on a geographic federalism, which means non-ethnic, non-religious federal, which is that the model really success model, not just only for Syria or for northern Syria, but for in the Middle East. And that's what we're thinking, all-inclusive, non-religious, non-ethnic people have been all this brutal civil war, northern communities, which we call them rather than minority, getting together, having social contract together, Arab, Kurds, Armenian, Christian, Yazidis, all together defended themselves, governing, sharing the power and duties together, and managing very well democratically and peacefully.
And that's been the position for the negotiations on the ground between you and...
Yes. And unfortunately, the negotiations, the international negotiations started from Geneva 2012. They have been consulted by the Mistura lately and previous UN negotiation in Geneva, but not invited officially and participated. And they, unfortunately, they said if we not have been invited on this, and this is why I think it's not fair that they excluded the northern Syrian federal system, which had been running peacefully and democratically, and most importantly, was contributed with huge sacrifices against ISIS, which is contributed to your safety in Europe, including UK and Europe, and stop this brutal coming to our Western country here and be a threat. And I think you, as a government in the UK, should recognize this contribution publicly and support these people who defeated and still defeating. And then our vision now, we're trying to transform this successful military defeat of this brutal threat, global threat, to a political settlement, a political negotiation, all-inclusive, the Syrian people who can shape and discuss their future. Unfortunately, this is Geneva so far for 8th now, and we think it wouldn't be successful because it's excluded 30% of the Syrians themselves who controlling the area has been excluded from them, and therefore we think the Syrian people themselves, we have to negotiate, discuss our future. And we appreciate the international UN effort to get us all together and agreed about it.
And what level of engagement have you had with the Foreign Office?
Sorry?
What level of engagement have you had with the Foreign Office?
We have and we still have engagement with the Foreign Office. We have been meeting most of the Syrian envoys to Syrian, the UK, and we keep contact. But unfortunately, I have to say, we would encourage it, but I have to say it is an occasional contact. But since 2015 and 16, after the liberation of Manbij and another area, I think the UK has get contact on the ground, and I'm pleased to hear they are on the ground in contact more there in the region, working closely with the civil administration for Manbij, Tabqa and Raqqa, as well as the civil councils. And I'm pleased to say that they have their own contact, established their contact, and working together there.
And how much support has the UK given directly to the PYD-YPG?
Officially haven't got any help or any direct, and we expected the UK to to support at least the humanitarian aid. And unfortunately, we do not have, despite having hosted about 2 million displaced people in the region, coming from different corners of the Syrian south, and even from Iraq, Yazidi from Shangali, now in Kamishli camp, Nowruz camp. We have 10,000 Yazidi still there in the camp, and unfortunately we haven't received, or at least encouraged, despite we have offered the UN and the UK for safeguarding them there to deliver their humanitarian aid personally, and just for transparency and free delivery. And unfortunately it didn't happen, and we just unfortunately trying on our very, very limited resources.
You are, however, receiving support from the United States.
Not political party as a PYD, but as a democratic self-administration of Rojava, yes. They are on contact and cooperation, and mostly military support is going to the self-administration, which YPG and YPJ are the military forces of the self-administration of Rojava and northern Syria, and not a military wing of PYD.
So the Americans have been giving you support. Are you confident that that's going to continue in the future?
Yes, and we hope though, because we see they have been promising their contribution, and they are on the ground in the contribution, and that, as I mentioned, the phase now is we try to establish for stabilization and democracy in that area, which we keep it with the coalition and the all ethnic minority group or communities in northern Syria.
The Turkish government has been very strongly critical of the United States giving support to Syrian Kurdish forces, and Turkey has military forces which have intervened into Syrian territory. Do you envisage potential conflict whereby your forces would have to fight against Turkish forces in the future?
Unfortunately, Turkey has been playing a very destructive role and is still occupying part of Syria, Idlib and Jarablus and Bab. Unfortunately, this was the Turkey who was contributed and facilitated. As you know, there are evidence, obvious evidence is arguable that Turkey opened its door and facilitated for all jihadis to come, 10,000 of jihadis coming through Turkey to ISIS. And the evidence is there that Turkey is destructing the democracy, the establishment of democracy in any region in its own southeast Kurdish area, and in Syria and Iraq and in Iran. So Turkey have this destructive policy against and Kurdish phobia, and unfortunately, yes, Turkey has been obstructed to this one, and I think the exclusion of the Kurds, of Syrian Kurds participating in Geneva and international platform for dialogue and peace have been prevented by Turkey. Turkey is the main destructive role in Syria.
Turkey argues, and members of our committee have heard this directly in Ankara, that there are links between the PYD and the PKK, and the reason why they are in Syria is to combat the PKK. Do you agree that the PKK is a terrorist organisation, which is the position that the British government takes?
No, I don't. And let me explain this one clearly, that we are a PYD, we are a Syrian Kurdish political party with its own leadership and decision making. So PYD is a Syrian and regarding as a Syrian political party and all decision making. However, we have an equal opportunity or equal relation with all political parties. We have been worked with KDP, Barzani himself, in 2014 in liberation of Kobani, and yesterday, or 2 days ago, 1st of December was election, the second election of the council election in northern Syria, which a parliamentarian from KRG coming and observed the election. But however, we including all this, I do not agree, we do not agree as and I think is non-Kurdish political party agrees about this statement that the PKK is a terrorist. Okay. All of them they saying is not, and we think is unfairly have been listed.
You've referred to your links to the KDP from the KRG. What links do you have with the PKK?
I do not have any organizational links, neither to the PKK or KDP or any political organization. I do have share the common Kurdish national interest and Kurdish stabilization and Kurdish security in the region.
So would this be then an ideological coherence rather than an organizational relationship?
It not be ideological. It will be that as some kind
national
common interest.
National in the sense of
national,
all
Kurdish,
the Kurds,
right, Kurds,
a greater Kurdish.
Kurdish national interest.
So you don't see, even though in the answer to a previous question you said that you wish to have a federal relationship with Syria, you're not arguing for a greater Kurdistan then, even though you regard yourselves as having a common ideological interest with other Kurds, whether in Turkey or in Iraq.
That's correct. It doesn't stop the support of the being Kurd, Syrian Kurd, and we think it will be in future. This is why we. Our vision for united Kurdistan, we think all the region has to be democratic, federal democratic, based on non-ethnic, non-religious factor. And in future, we have now two regions which are hopefully, supposedly will be a federal system, and if you have a federal system in Turkey in future, and if we have a federal system, democratic, decentralized in Iran, then we can talk and suggest about the Kurdish self-determination for confederal united Kurdistan in future. But at the moment, the circumstances, the regional circumstances, the international circumstances is not mature there to get that position, because we need first democratized and decentralized this government as Turkey, as Iran, and so on.
Final question from me. You've mentioned your relationships with the US. What are your relations with Russia?
It's same, in same balance, in same position there, because yes, unfortunately, there are Russian and American who are controlling the airspace mostly in Syria, and we have to deal with both of them in same equal position and equal interest, some very common interest. So if they are going to help us defeat ISIS and democratizing and self-governing the region, so the cooperation is...
But the US is actually giving weaponry to the Syrian Kurds. Are the Russians?
Somewhere they are Russian as well, but they are officially the coalition. I think they are working mostly with the coalition. I cannot speak militarily for YPG and YPJ, but they are, yes, militarily very well cooperated, and the coalition is supporting them on the ground, and now they, yes, therefore we think they are continuing for the stabilization and the peace process, democratization of the area, such as Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Tabqa, and Manbij, and another mixed area. And one point maybe it can be helpful to mention it. So if it's a federal, non-ethnic, non-religious federal, so we don't have, as a previous issue, we don't have a issue and with the disputed area or with mixed area. And this was, we make it sure from start, right, we governing ourselves regionally, ourselves democratically and peacefully, join together with coexistence of communities.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Ian.
Could I ask whether Kurdish forces in Syria, including the YPG, have largely avoided fighting the Assad regime?
Yes. Yes, if somebody not attacking me, what should I attack? And the next question is why I should make it enemy with our no enemies? Why I should wake the lion while he's sleeping or weak? Yes, I should be smart enough, peacefully approach it, the issue, and not fight to which is not necessary. But we have been doing this. We did it in Aleppo in 2012. There are still 500,000 Kurds in Aleppo, in Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafiyah. They are still controlling it, despite, yes, Aleppo fall because of the deal of Erdogan and Assad of selling out Aleppo against Idlib, and the Kurds still keeping their position and then governing themselves and protecting themselves. And in Hasaka, we did it in 2016, fight the regime, and we did it just 2 weeks ago when the regime's trying to push on the Syrian Democratic Forces in Deir ez-Zor.
Do you think there might be a point when do you think the Kurdish forces in Syria might have to fight the regime in the future? Or do you think you're prepared to negotiate and reach a deal with Assad?
Hopefully it wouldn't be. We are against the violence, we're against the war. We don't want this war, and we think that war has been opposed to us, and we don't want it. We are against the violence, but if somebody is going to attack us, we would rather just defend ourselves and protecting ourselves, which we have been controlling this. And I think the Kurdish forces, also Syrian Democratic Forces now, they are not attacking forces, they are defending forces, they are governing themselves forces, and they're protecting themselves. They have not ever attacked some another forces, apart, of course, from ISIS, with the coalition and with the Arab and Syriac, which are the Christian forces as well.
So you think there'll be a deal with Assad eventually?
If Assad regime is going to try to attack us and take it, yes. The Kurdish forces, they're saying, yes, we are ready and we can defend ourselves, but rather not do that. It's not wise, and we don't want it to any conflict. We have a political solution. We wanted political solution. We could come to the table, but we have to do it ourselves. Only Syrians. We can shape and discuss about our future. We have to decide our future. We don't want any settlement, even if it's a peaceful settlement, and even if it's democratic, opposed on us. We want to be part of it. We decided, we agreed about it.
Mike? Yep.
Can I ask you about your relationship with the many tens, hundreds of thousands of Syrian Kurds who fled into Iraq? The KRG is hosting large numbers of people who are actually refugees, as well as the internally displaced people from Iraq. I've had conversations with some of those people, and they told me that they found that the situation in the areas that were controlled by the YPG as difficult for them, because they were not supporters of the ideology of the group there. So although you've said democratic many times, are you really democratic? Do you respect diversity of political views within your structures?
Definitely, we do that, and we can prove it that, and that's why I take this opportunity to invite you to go to the northern Syria, and see in northern Syria how democratic they have been to elections. There are 16 parties, Kurds and non-Kurds have been people electing themselves freely and democratically. And all the another, what you call it, the community, the minority have been. We have Syriac forces. We have a colleague here. Now he has been fighting with the Syriac Christian forces against ISIS. And we have Arab co-chairs and administration and themselves. And the federal administration is a co-chair of Arab. And yes, it is a democratic, and as it is based on grassroots democracy, gender equality, and ecological democratic solution in that way. So it is democratic, and I would offer you, yes, we will provide you your safeguarding. Go to northern Syria, see how this de facto governance, self-governance, democratic self-governance, see how it is democratic, see on your eyes, and come and evaluate it to us, and you will find it the de facto, or the fact would push on there. And we have, I think we are very, we are open to critique, as we take it welcome, we will learn from it, and we will learn from it, but we have, just example, I will give you 3 main factors that we ourselves preventing to be one-party dominant. One example of that one is we have a code, we have a percentage. In these elections, the minority have a 50% right to have a seat. For example, in Kamishli, yes, so it is just example percentage, so it is 90% Kurds and 10% Syriac. And these Syriac people, and in the council itself, so there will be not just 2% of 90%, it will be Assyriac. So they have equal seats. So the Assyrian people in Kamishli Council, they have equal seat as a Kurd, as Arab, and another community there. So the equal representative is one thing, and the co-chair, which is the system, is not, to prevent patriarchy, you not like it, that word. So the gender equality, and they have their same right. Women, every single commune, every single election, the women have their participation of 50%. And therefore we're thinking this is against patriarchy, to prevent not just men sitting and deciding on the health care, women care, and women's health. And the most importantly, the percentage, the participation of all non-ethnic religious minority on there, in that same equal opportunity. Therefore, we call it the egalitarians democracy. If you don't like the word democracy, yes, I would say egalitarian, so equal opportunity, equal sharing, and equal duties.
Okay. Go on, Ian. No. Very briefly, if you want to. No. Okay. In that case, Mr. Jamal, thank you very much indeed for coming. We are going to switch witnesses again, very quickly, I hope. Mr. Park. I suspect you may have been right. Mr. Lowe, if you'd care to join us, it would be wonderful. Now, we've had some very full answers from our previous 2 witnesses, for which we're very grateful, but do feel free to be brief, and there's no need to repeat one another's points if you agree. Ian, you want to start us off?
Yeah. Hi. We were in Kirkuk at the same time of the referendum, yes. So I mean, I'd like to ask how united you think the Kurdish public and the Kurdish political parties were behind the referendum?
Not very. As you say, I was in Kirkuk, otherwise based in Erbil, so I mainly operated in KDP-controlled areas or in Kirkuk, in an area controlled by that part of the PUK that was sympathetic to the referendum. But I had put together a team of observers, or half a team of observers, some of whom spent the day in places like Sulaymaniyah, and they found no campaigning, no joyousness on the streets. And the reports of the turnout in places like Sulaymaniyah were about 50%, in Erbil and in the Kurdish parts of Kirkuk, maybe 90%. So it wasn't until the very eve of the referendum that the PUK said, OK, grudgingly, we'll support the referendum, but it's quite obvious they then split down the middle. And Karwan said, the other main Kurdish party in Iraq, said, we won't instruct our supporters how to vote. So they were neither for nor against. When you look at what happened in Kirkuk, both running up to the referendum and after the referendum, I think the split in the PUK was clearly quite substantial. I mean, I heard on a grapevine that some Peshmerga was sent by one element of the PUK into Kirkuk to get the local PUK elements in Kirkuk to enable the referendum to take place. Also, you have to note that there were questionings before about what happened in Kirkuk when the Peshmerga left. You only have to look at President Barzani's statement, which was that we were betrayed by an element within the PUK. So I think there were splits between KDP on the one hand and Karwan and PUK on the other, and then splits within the PUK.
Do you think that if the results were disaggregated, how do you think Kirkuk, as a city by itself, would have voted?
Well, Kirkuk it's a disputed city, not just between Erbil and Baghdad, but amongst the people that live there. So the Turkmen and Arabs, by and large, boycotted the referendum. Turkmen and Arab leaders did not vote to hold the referendum in Kirkuk. I went to... We were told there were mixed areas, but I think there were primarily Turkmen areas. I would say the turnout was about 30%. 30%. I mean, we went to polling stations at the beginning and at the end of the day and counted the votes. We stood in one of the polling stations for an hour towards the end of the voting day. Nobody came in during that hour. If you went to the Kurdish parts of Kirkuk, it looked like 90% turnout. And obviously great enthusiasm as well. So it was the tale of two cities, really. If you look at local elections, because Kirkuk is excluded from the federal elections in Iraq, if you look at local elections that have taken place in Kirkuk, the Kurdish parties get about half of the vote. And my guess is that about a half of Kirkuk would vote. And it's Kirkuk is city and the area around. It's the province, in effect. Probably about half of it would vote for independence. Kurds will vote for independence. I mean, they won't vote against it. They might abstain because they're upset with Barzani or because there hasn't been much campaigning or they feel they've been neglected by Erbil. But they will vote for independence. The issue in places like Kirkuk is not really Kurds. It's much more the Turkmen and the Arabs who alienated.
But you would say that, I mean, would you say the referendum was free and fair? Were the turnout figures accurate?
I did have a couple of meetings with the guy who headed up the Electoral Commission. The main impression I got was a certain amount of chaos. I don't particularly blame the organisers. The referendum was called quite late in the day. Remember, it was called in a disputed area where the Turkmen and Arab parties were boycotting the referendum, as well as in Kurdistan proper. The elections were also extended to refugee camps. So there was quite a lot of chaos, and I have a number of instances of that if you want me to enlarge on them. We found in Kirkuk, for example, that unlike in Kurdistan proper, where the votes were counted in the local balloting stations, which is normally in quite a lot of countries. I was with a Dutch colleague, and he said that's what happens in Holland. In Kirkuk, the votes were collected and taken to a central counting station. And when I asked the head of the Kurdistan Electoral Commission what had happened, he said, I didn't know about that. Probably the governor of Kirkuk ordered it for security reasons, which is plausible. But the fact that the head of the commission didn't know that had happened, suggests a certain amount of chaos and confusion about it. We also found in a polling station that was in a Turkmen area but opposite a military base, we counted about 600 people had voted. And then we found that on the box with all the ballots in at the end of the day, there were 1,600 votes. So he said, where did the other 1,000 votes come from? And we were told that the Peshmerga had turned up and voted. So he said, well, how can that happen? And what we were told by the head of the Electoral Commission when I saw him the day after or the day after that, 1 or 2 days after the referendum, he said because we had moved so many Peshmerga into Kirkuk and other insecure areas, we gave them the right to vote outside of their base areas and in the areas that they had been redeployed to. It's a plausible explanation. But it does suggest a certain amount of sort of chaos and confusion and not the kind of centralised organisation that we might expect. I don't entirely blame the organisers for that. It's a very difficult situation, but we found that.
I mean, I think I went to, 8, maybe 10 polling stations. And I was quite impressed. I mean, there was a register of electors.
Yeah.
There were proper security checks. People were queuing up. They had to show who they were. The actual polling station inside looked very much like a polling station would do in Britain. And once you voted, and you weren't able to vote until you sort of inked your finger so that you couldn't vote twice. I mean, I thought it looked pretty robust and democratic and well organised to me. I mean, I didn't really see the only chaotic, well, not chaotic, but was when Talabani's wife turned up to voting, which was the media, not the administration of the poll. I mean, I thought it was pretty robust and,
I didn't go to the refugee camps. I'm talking about colleagues that went there and told me how chaotic it was. People being told you can't vote here, you have to go somewhere else, or you can't vote at all, or whatever. So lots of disputes about entitlement to vote and where votes should be cast. And I agree entirely with what you've just said in the Kurdish areas, entirely. I think the issue is in the disputed areas. I do have about half a dozen photographs that I took you'd have about 10 names on a page of voters, you would have seen that. And if somebody was illiterate, they would have a thumbprint. So in those polling stations where maybe the turnout was 30%, you would get 1 or 2 or 3 voters on each page, so averaged out. But I've got photographs of whole pages where everyone has voted. And you'd have a page with 1 signature, and another page with another signature, and another page with another signature. And if you looked at the birth dates, you could see that some of the people would be quite young, surely therefore literate. Some older, maybe not literate, but not using their thumbprint. And when we questioned people on that, they told us that, they were illiterate people. So we said, and we signed it for them. Why were there 10 illiterate people on one page, one name after another? I don't think that was systematic. I genuinely, honestly don't think it makes much difference to the overall vote. I think this happened in a mixed of Turkmen and Arab, mainly Turkmen area. But it did happen. In the Kurdish areas, which is pretty much all of Kurdistan proper, and big chunks as well of the disputed areas, I agree entirely with you. I think there were issues in those disputed areas where the vote was being boycotted.
Thanks, Chair.
Having observed 2 elections in Iraq in the past, was there any evidence in this election of intimidation?
We were told, I was told by the head of the Electoral Commission that one of the problems they had in the disputed areas was that Turkmen and Arab citizens who had volunteered to man the polling stations had been intimidated and withdrawn at the last minute. That's plausible. So that's intimidation not by Kurds, but by those political groupings that sought to boycott the election. Intimidation by Kurds of Kurds, I saw no evidence. I wouldn't have expected to see it. It wouldn't have been necessary. Because, as I say, very few Kurds would vote against independence. There were low turnouts in some areas, but very few would vote against independence. So there would be no particular need for intimidation. But I did hear that, as I say, Turkmen and Arab citizens that had volunteered to man polling stations had been frightened off by their communities. And that, I think, is probably to be expected.
To what extent would you describe the KRG as being democratic?
Well, I personally am uneasy with the way we throw that word around, even when it applies to ourselves. So I have to put that context in order to answer the question. KRG has elections, and the two main or three main parties are elected. And there's very little evidence in the past that there's been much manipulation or corruption or intimidation of that voting. So in that sense, I would say democratic. But if you then ask a question, well, then what happens after elections? Basically, Kurdistan is run by patronage networks, this fairly complete division of power, which applies to the Peshmerga as well. Jobs, contracts are handed out according to those patronage networks. Both Erbil and Baghdad, probably Baghdad more so, but both play fast and loose with the idea of rule of law and constitutional provision. So we could, if we wanted, say that Kurdistan is not especially democratic. On the other hand, compared to, I would say, most of the rest of Iraq and most of the rest of the region, it's not so bad. So if you like, it's democratic in its own way. Elections certainly take place, and there's not much evidence that they're anything other than reasonably free and reasonably fair.
Okay. Royston, would you?
Chairman, written evidence to our inquiry has said that the UK was involved in a project to unify the Kurdish Peshmerga and overcome its divided political loyalties. How successful do you think that has been?
I think it's necessary to try, so I think it's the proper kind of approach to take, and I would apply it not only to the Peshmerga but to administration and governance in Kurdistan generally. There needs to be unification of the KDP and the PUK elements, but most importantly in the Peshmerga. The problem is, in a sense, the one that I already stated. Kurdistan works by patronage networks. You could say via tribalism. It's a bit of an oversimplification. I think patronage is the better explanation. Region as well, to a large degree. So you can take, let's say, a PUK brigade and allocate it to a unified Peshmerga, the Ministry of Peshmerga. But you can't be sure that that brigade is ultimately going to take its orders from anybody other than the head of its patronage network. So those PUK elements of the Peshmerga that have been allocated to the unified Peshmerga, I think when it comes down to it, will be primarily loyal to the PUK. Those elements of KDP Peshmerga that are allocated to the unified Peshmerga would ultimately be loyal to the KDP. Not on every issue. If the KDP and PUK are united against a common enemy, then they would fight, I guess, in a united way. But I've even, this is not personal experience, but someone who's had personal experience told me that they were with the unified Peshmerga. And if a KDP commander came in the room, the KDP elements of the unified Peshmerga would stand to attention, the PUK elements would not, and vice versa. PUK commander walks into the room, the PUK elements of the Peshmerga stand to attention, the KDP elements do not. It's a very small sort of insight into the continuation of these divisions between the patronage networks. So necessary to try, progress can be made. I dare say some progress has been made, but ultimately the allocation of those Peshmerga units are by the KDP and the PUK. I would say the ultimate loyalty, where does the money come from, where do the jobs come from, will be to KDP and PUK bosses.
Do you know which units the UK has armed or trained, and whether those units have fought against Iraqi federal forces?
As I understand it, I worked for King's, but used to work in the Defence Academy, and we used to have Peshmerga officers from the Unified Peshmerga on the staff course there that we taught. As I understand it, when the British or others, the Americans and the Germans actually become quite heavily involved in recent months and years, when they train the Unified Peshmerga, they train the Unified Peshmerga. They don't differentiate. That it would be to destroy the purpose of the enterprise to differentiate. So they treat them as a single Unified Peshmerga. No political preference. It would be silly to have that from every point of view, and I think it doesn't exist. But at the same time, so you can arm people, you can train people, you can bring people up to a certain professional standard, you can create an organisational structure for a unified Peshmerga that looks like a unified military structure that might apply to, well, the UK or Germany or the US. But in practice, it might not work that way. And about that, it's really hard to do much from outside. This is something that Iraqi Kurds themselves have to overcome. Can they soften the impact of patronage and political loyalty and enlarge the area of genuine unification? And that would apply, as I say, not only to Peshmerga, but to governments as well, across the whole piece. But I think the British and others are quite fair and down the middle and unbiased in what they do with those elements of Peshmerga that are allocated to the Ministry of Peshmerga.
And have they been used, in your opinion, against Iraqi federal forces?
Now, as I understand it, I mean, most of the fighting around Mosul was really by the PMU or the Iraqi forces. And what the Kurds did was basically hold the eastern side of Mosul, because that's where the Kurds live. The villages gradually peter out into majority Kurdish areas. I understand as well there are elements of the unified Peshmerga down near Kirkuk. I'm not sure that they did put up much of a fight. I mean, it's true some Kurdish fighters lost their lives. It's not clear who they were. It's much clearer that PUK, KDP and unified Peshmerga elements left the scene in Kirkuk after the referendum. So exactly what happened on the ground down in Kirkuk, I don't think we're very clear about yet. But there was no major fighting. But certainly unified Peshmerga elements were down there, that's for sure.
And do you think there's any risk of renewed violence? I mean, it's quieter now than it was, and it seems to have calmed down somewhat. But do you think there's any risk of any renewed violence, and if so, why? Between Kurdish forces and Iraqis?
Absolutely, I do. I think at the moment you have a number of things going on. One is some degree of ethnic cleansing, I suppose would be the emotive term, but that probably amounts to that. In Kirkuk, certainly, in Tuzkamata, in other areas. And also you have from Baghdad and from elements of the PMU a degree of, I could say Iraqi, but maybe it's really Shia triumphalism, or Arab triumphalism maybe, which is in a sort of mood for revenge. I mean, this is there with Abadi. You heard the story about the German foreign minister. If you want to visit Baghdad, you can't also visit Erbil, and if you want to do that, you can't come at all. That kind of arguments about the budget, arguments about whether governments can represent themselves in Erbil. So there's a lot of triumphalism coming out of Baghdad at the moment. And that could turn nasty. I mean, the real red line is Kurdistan proper, what they used to call the green line. You know, the three governorates that make up the undisputed part of Kurdistan. it doesn't look like Iraq is going to challenge that, and if they don't, that probably keeps it lower key. But if ethnic cleansing continues and these arguments about budget and energy and all the rest of it continue, then one can see the scope for violence in the future.
You happy? Mike, you were going to come in.
Yes, I'm going to switch focus to Syria. What's your assessment of the motivation of those who fight for the PYD?
I think there are a number of different groups we could identify. I think firstly there would be the ideologues, people who have supported the activities of the PKK for many years, and its later manifestation in Syria is the PYD, and so they believe in the ideology of that movement and of Abdullah Öcalan, and are very much part of that party complex and the goals of the wider PKK operation. More recently, especially since the outbreak of the war and the takeover of the territories in the north of Syria by the PYD, a number of other groups have signed up, if you like, to the project or have joined the party, or perhaps in greater numbers joined the military, the paramilitary and the YPG. This again is for a number of reasons. One will be a sense of Kurdish identity, even Kurdish nationalism, and currently this party and this military are the only viable actor and offer on the ground. If you're a Kurd living in the north of Syria and you want to take part, this is where you would direct your energies if you wish to join the fight against IS and help secure a Kurdish governed territory. Linked to that, there will be people who have been opportunistic, because if you want to get on, if you want to advance, you need to be part of these new structures, this party and this paramilitary, or you don't have much chance of advancement. There are suggestions that there have been coercion. There is an element of conscription in the YPG military that is not entirely popular amongst all the population in the Kurdish areas.
Is that conscription of women as well as men?
I don't know if women are conscripted too. I know that men have been. I would need to check about women.
Okay. Do they have any idea what they actually want after the war against Daesh?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they do have a vision. They have a plan. We heard from our colleague from the PYD earlier, who outlined some of the ideas underlying the project, the political experiment, if we like, which is underway. It's all underpinned by Kurdish nationalism, but as we heard, there are also political, radical leftist ideas of democratic autonomy, democratic confederalism. I won't go into detail on these, partly because it's quite difficult to, and I'm not entirely qualified, but in essence it's building a grassroots form of democracy from the bottom up, through local councils, through local communes, and doing away with top-down state control. Is this
like a Maoist ideology? You know, this was like in the 60s and 70s, some of the far-left groups in this country and elsewhere had a sense of what they call stable base areas in the centre of the imperialist heartlands. I remember the phrase.
Well,
I've had that kind of...
The PKK's origins are as a Marxist-Leninist organisation, but it has evolved over the years, and its ideology now, as espoused by Abdullah Öcalan, is largely based on the thinking of an American thinker, Murray Bookchin, and his ideas. Murray Bookchin is the US thinker whose work underpins some of their ideas. But to set that to one side, I think they also have a clear vision now of what practical political structure they want to put in place in northern Syria, or the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, as it's now called, rather than Rojava per se, and some idea as to the geographic borders of that territory and the political, social, economic structures they wish to create within that.
Would those geographic borders include within them areas that are currently occupied by Turkish troops?
I think if they could, yes, they would. Before the Turkish army across the border into the corridor of northern Syria, where they are currently still present, which is between two of the Kurdish majority districts. It's clear that the YPG were about to take that territory and had every intention of joining up two of the Kurdish cantons to create a contiguous strip of territory all along the northern Syrian border. Turkey's actions prevented that. I think if the Turks did withdraw, the YPG would be likely to try to take that territory. That there is a problem for them in that the westernmost canton of Afrin is cut off from the other Kurdish districts and from the rest of northern Syria, Rojava. And it's of course very difficult to coordinate and to support that Kurdish district because it is so isolated.
We heard earlier that from Mr. Semo that they had no desire to initiate conflict with the Assad regime, but that there were examples of where there had been fighting. Would you assess that in general they've tried to avoid conflict and fighting with Assad and concentrated mainly on the fighting against Daesh or other Islamist groups?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. That's accurate. The most pressing threat has been that of of IS and other Islamist groups. The Kurds were in a fairly perilous position back in 2013, 2014. It was very serious around the siege of Kobani, the town which did survive when the US and others helped intervene. I think both for the Kurds and for the Assad regime, they've had far graver, far more serious threats to deal with first, far more urgent and immediate, and they've been able to set aside the question of their own slightly fractious, difficult relationship and the question of how that will look one day when there is finally a settlement. Because pragmatically it has suited each other that they've not been fighting. Neither has needed another front, and they've both had to deal with IS in the first instance. When that is all settled, if it ever is, they may look to each other.
Final question from me. The area of Mount Sinjar, I'm not particularly good with the geography, but as I understand it, there were different Kurdish forces fighting there to liberate it and to protect the Yazidis and so others. And that included some cooperation between Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga and PKK people and PYD people. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So the Peshmerga were there initially. They were struggling. The PKK and YPG together crossed over and joined the fight and were largely instrumental ultimately in rescuing the Yazidis and taking Mount Sinjar. And they've remained there. And they're still operational in that area, which is another question which relates to the relationship of northern Syria, Rojava, to the Kurdistan region, Iraq, and the Kurdistan and the KDP, Kurdistan Democratic Party. The presence is still there. I mean, there's been a PKK presence in Kurdistan, Iraq for many years, but of course another part. But their intervention there means they have a foothold in that part of Iraq also.
Can I just add to that? It's just the Yazidis are quite interesting because some Yazidis have joined the PKK YPG, but some have joined the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga. Some have formed PMUs, and some have formed purely Yazidi defence forces. So Yazidis have become quite fragmented. I don't know how deep those fragmentations are. It might be, as you say, sort of opportunism. Where does the power lie in your immediate locality? But it's quite an interesting sort of aftermath of this struggle that Bob was talking about. The Yazidis themselves have come quite split between different Kurdish elements as well as, if you like, non-Kurdish elements.
Okay, thank you.
Anne, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, could I just ask you about the Yazidis, because at the time I was following quite closely what was going on, at least I thought. And to begin with, reports were that the Yazidis had all been rescued, that everything was going to be okay. And then suddenly things turned, and we heard Yazidis were not safe. And there was several confusing reports about what actually happened at various stages. Can you enlighten me on that?
I think Bill's perhaps better placed than I am.
Yeah, it's sort of inside Iraq. I mean, first of all, we don't know what happened to all the Yazidis, and still mass graves are being found. So one of the problems about whether they're all liberated is a question about are all those that are still alive liberated? How do we account for those that we haven't yet located? So you still find mass graves, and they are the responsibility of IS. Also, I think bear in mind Yazidis are quite scattered. I mean, we talk about Mount Sinjar, which is the main concentration, the sort of purest concentration of Yazidis, but they are scattered down towards the Nineveh plain and so on. So we have a kind of patchier picture of different parts of the sort of Yazidi populated areas. And then it's the mess on the ground to do with, people will have lost contact with their families and neighbours, and this is not only Yazidis, it's Kurds and Arabs and so on. So people might report somebody as missing because they genuinely think they're missing and they haven't been found, but they might be somewhere else. They might have washed up in a refugee camp or across the border somewhere. So it's actually genuinely quite difficult to get a proper sense in the whole of this area that we are talking about of who is where and who is still surviving. And you will probably find in 5 years' time, people will suddenly reconnect with each other, find that the other side of the family survived when they didn't think it did. I mean, you've got a lot of chaos on the ground. I think it's very difficult to get an accurate picture. My guess is there are still people that we have not accounted for, and whether they are still alive but somewhere we haven't yet identified that those are the people we haven't accounted for, or whether we will find a mass grave at some point, we don't know.
So just to add, if I may, I have colleagues at LSE who are demographers, and they're running a project documenting Yazidi victims. If it would be interesting, I could share some of that with you.
But who took responsibility for them in the end? Because there were stories of women being sold as sex slaves, being raped, being held in camps. I mean, and then the issue seemed to sort of disappear.
Well, perhaps received less media attention once the atrocities had ended, but it's left obviously a deeply traumatised, fractured and troubled population in the refugee camps and elsewhere, and indeed there are a number in Europe as well who made it over to Germany or elsewhere. There's a camp in Greece which is purely for Yazidis in the Greek mountains, which I know is a difficult place for them to be settled. They had to separate them from other refugees because they were being attacked by the other refugees when they got to Greece, so they have their own camp in northern Greece. And
some elements of IS have somehow freed themselves from both Raqqa and Mosul and other areas, and they've taken their entourage, their caravan with them, and probably in there as well there are Yazidi women that are still held captive, but they're still with IS elements that are in the field somewhere.
So who was mainly responsible for rescuing the Yazidis?
PKK and YPG.
People?
PKK and YPG, yeah. The PKK.
PKK.
And Barzani thanked them, by the way.
Just one question is whether the PYD has the PYD restricted political opposition in the territory under its control, and if so, how has it done it?
Yes, the PYD talks very confidently about being tolerant and pluralist, and we heard earlier how many parties there are operating. There's been a proliferation of political, social activity in northern Syria since the regime pulled back. But that said, there is a problem in that the large, or used to be large, faction of Kurdish parties who are not of the PKK strain, indeed they long predate the PYD and the PKK. Their roots as Kurdish nationalist parties in Syria go back to the 1950s, and there were 18, 19 of these parties at the outbreak of the war. They have struggled. They struggled to operate. There are a number of incidents which are quite well documented of harassment, of threats, intimidation, kidnapping, and these parties largely now struggle to function in Rojava, northern Syria, unless they choose to sign up to the project. if they join in the administration, the democratic self-administration, they are allowed to function. A number of them have. They've gone over because they see it's the only way they can operate. Others, still loosely under an umbrella coalition called the Kurdish National Council, the KNC, have been seriously weakened. Their leaders now tend to be in Erbil in Kurdistan, Iraq, or they're in London or elsewhere in Europe because they're not able to function. So it's a difficult issue for the PYD to reconcile this inability of Kurdish political parties who do not support their project to function. The way they've operated with other ethnicities is to many extents impressive and commendable. You know, they warmly welcome in Arabs, Turkmen and the Christian minorities into the project. The record does not look to be so good with other Kurdish parties whom they have seen as a threat.
Mike, you wanted to come in briefly?
Yeah, that confirms what I was told in a refugee camp in Iraq in 2013, when I spoke to some people who had come from Syria and were clearly didn't feel comfortable in that environment. Can I ask you about the relationships of the PKK and PYD with the PUK? We've talked about the KDP area and the Sinjar, but there were non-PUK forces fighting to get Daesh out of Kirkuk. Did they come from Syria, or were they PKK from Turkey?
So there were non-PUK forces
in Kirkuk.
Yeah.
When the fighting there took place to drive out Daesh, I was told that there were people who actually came and helped and died fighting with the Peshmerga there, who were PUK, and they were PKK. I'm interested to know, were they Syrians or were they Turks?
Bill may wish to answer this, join in this, but the first point is yes, the relationship between the PUK and the PKK, and indeed the PYD, is better than between the KDP and those parties. Historically, there has been less of a struggle between the PUK and the PKK than that between the KDP. So, to put it quite cheaply, it's between the followers of Barzani or the followers of Öcalan who's going to be paramount as the leader of Kurdish people in the region. And that's been less of an issue for the PUK.
So Talabani did not have the same status then?
Wasn't quite part of the same overall master struggle, if you will, for the soul of the Kurdish nationalist movement in the region. More complex and perhaps also reflected by the rivalry between the PUK and the KDP. The PUK chose at times to be more open to the PKK. There was fighting, which was KDP-PKK, wasn't it, in the 90s in the Kandil Mountains. The suggestion that those fighters were PKK, if they were PKK in Kirkuk, they could have been of Turkish or Syrian origin. A disproportionately large number of the PKK have always been Kurds from Syria, much larger than each population is in balance. They've always been heavily represented in the PKK. It doesn't really matter if you see it. I mean, it's all part of the same complex, whether they're badged PKK or YPG, or whether they're Kurds from Turkey or Kurds from Syria. If they follow the ideology, it's the same movement.
But the essence of the issue is that there are Kurds who are prepared to go and fight and die to defend other Kurds in areas which are many miles away from where they live, where their families were.
We know there are Kurds from Iran as well as from Turkey who are fighting for the YPG in Syria, fighting to defend other Kurds. This is quite common.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Turkish security analyst who calculates that about 30% of the PKK fighters actually have Syrian Kurdish origin. I mean, I find that figure a little bit high personally. But it reinforces the point that Bob made, that a lot of what we think of the PKK as the Turkish Kurds actually might have Syrian Kurdish origin. And right now in Rojava, the same the other way around.
So when the Turkish government allege that the PYD are actually PKK, there is some truth in that.
we cannot separate the PYD from the PKK. The PYD would not exist if the PKK did not exist. It was founded out of the PKK party complex, the structure. As we heard earlier, the PYD states it is only ideologically linked to the PKK. It is a sister organisation. There's no operational control from the PKK. Others disagree. I mean, you could read Crisis Group's report from May this year. They don't even bother calling the party the PYD. They just call it the PKK in Syria. That's how they see it. I think there are subtle distinctions, even though clearly they're very close. And those distinctions largely come down to the context. The PYD is governing. It's having to run local administration services, functioning economy in northern Syria. The PKK remains a guerrilla organisation in the mountains carrying out a disruptive armed campaign in Turkey. The PYD also needs the support of a large number of Kurds who are not traditionally PKK supporters. So they have to be a bit more open, a bit more tolerant, a bit more pluralist in how they operate. Another distinction is that until 2012, the PYD, indeed the whole Kurdish movement in Syria, had never taken up arms. It's an entirely new dimension to the Syrian Kurdish movement in the struggle. It had not been violent before. And related to that, I think it's credible to back the PYD's view or the YPG's view that their movement is self-defence primarily. They haven't been on the offensive. They've been protecting the peoples of northern Syria. That maybe has changed a little bit now because they're pushing out into other areas. It boils down to a critical question for the future of Rojava and indeed the PKK as a movement, which is it in control in northern Syria? Is it calling the shots? Or is it prepared to leave this political experiment to develop as a Syrian operation, run largely by Syrian Kurds, but other Syrian ethnicities, and let them decide how to run their administration while retaining links to the PKK's larger structure?
Okay, thank you.
Well, you've asked many, many, many questions. I just had one, if I may, just to tie you up very briefly, Mr. Park, which is how many polling stations did you visit?
Half a dozen, 6 in Kirkuk. Roughly equally split between polling stations in primarily or entirely Kurdish areas and polling stations in what we were told were mixed areas, but all of them were in schools that were Turkmen schools with Turkmen names.
So they were predominantly Turkmen?
I would think they were predominantly Turkmen, but we were told there were Arabs there as well.
Okay. Well, I have no further questions. Does anybody? No? Can I thank you both very much indeed for your extremely full and succinct answers.
Thank you.
Order session is now ended.
The proceeding has ended.